We are live. Good afternoon for our friends here on the East Coast, and good morning to the rest of the country. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I have my partner in crime here, Joe Ross, who's a senior vice president at AIG. Coming up on a holiday weekend, so we appreciate you tuning in. This presentation is something special, and it's always a pleasure to work and present with Joe. This is part two of a three-part series to use emerging legislation to spark life insurance sales. And in part one, we kind of set the table for what's to come. The Biden platform introduced some of the Sanders and Elizabeth Warren bills. The clock is running out on gifting opportunities. And as we transition today, we're going to get a little bit more technical. We're going to dive into a couple of concepts. One being step up in basis, two being capital gains. And we're going to really look at an area of taxation that was truly an awakening to me to actually do the math and see the potential loss of asset value passing from one generation to the next, given the rumblings in Congress and the Biden platform and what's being discussed. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my friend Joe Ross here. We'll get the slides started, and I'll take you through a quick agenda. Joe, welcome.
Hey, Anthony. Great to be here again today. Always great to share the podium with you. And you are absolutely spot on that today's content is truly cutting edge. The people who are joining us today are going to be hearing about things, connecting dots in ways that you and I haven't seen anybody else in the industry connecting. So, kudos to all of you for investing some time in growing your expertise today to be able to do a better job for your clients and learn things that the competition simply hasn't figured out yet. So thanks for being here. Anthony, thanks for teeing this up for us.
We appreciate you, Joe. Are we rolling with the slides, Joe?
We go ahead and put the slides up. Host disabled participant screen sharing. You might have to make me a presenter.
There you go.
All right, we're active now. Let me grab the right deck. Zoom does a different way of presenting which deck you grab. So gotta make sure I grab the right one here.
Gosh. We're going to break out today's agenda into 5 parts. First is going to be the impact of deficits, GDP, and tax policy. We'll move specifically into tax policy and give you some hard facts. I'll touch on what I call the sleight of hand and the step up in basis calculations and how we may address those. Section 4 is going to be the awakening, right? And that's where the math doesn't lie. We're going to take you through a case study, and you can see what the ramifications are of losing the step up in basis. And then we'll clean it up with some income taxes, which, kind of work in reverse, where, the country is really focused on income taxation, and there's tons of content being pushed out. And that's where we focus the majority of our time in part 1 of our series. But as we dig into this, we're going to kind of go in reverse. We're going to talk about the ramifications of passing an appreciated asset at death and how that will potentially spark life insurance sales. So, Joe?
All right. So usually I don't show off the compliance disclosures, but this is one in particular that I feel is relevant. Just know that everything that I'm talking today is founded in speculation. We don't have any tax proposals on the things that we're talking about today. What we are talking about is things that we believe could happen in the foreseeable future based on what the Biden administration talked about prior to being elected, during the debate season and things like that. So what we're focusing is talking about what might happen and the consequences that we'll be facing if they happen. So I just wanted to touch on those disclosures to let you know, Anthony and I are not commenting on new tax law. We're not even commenting on new tax proposals. We're commenting on what the Biden administration has clearly expressed as their interest. And if they succeed in what they're doing, now that they control the Oval Office and they control the House and they control the Senate for at least 2 years, what they might get away with. So just use that as a kind of a background.
Joe, give us a little color on, there's a new infrastructure bill announced just yesterday, and it looks like it's going to top off somewhere around $2 trillion. Give us a little bit of color on the deficit, how GDP plays into paying down that deficit, and tax policy that addresses how to pay down some of this deficit and raise enough capital to service the interest on it.
Well, funny sidebar story. You might remember this, but right before 2008, when we had the massive crumbling of the housing bubble, right? The mortgage bubble burst. There was a commercial on television from one of the hotshot online lenders where they had this guy driving his lawnmower tractor around his front yard, and his house is absolutely beautiful. It's this big, gorgeous home. He's got a boat on his driveway clipped onto the back of his gorgeous sport utility vehicle, everything looking great. And the guy on the commercial says, Bob has a beautiful home, a gorgeous property, a great boat, a beautiful car, and a wonderful life. Bob, how do you do it? And as he's rolling across the lawn in his lawnmower, he looks over at the camera and he says, I'm in debt up to my eyeballs. I thought when the mortgage bubble burst in 2008 that we would realize that we can't just borrow and borrow and borrow and borrow endlessly. If you make $200,000 a year, you can't just borrow another $100,000 and spend like you make $300,000 a year. You just can't do that forever. Unfortunately, that's kind of what our government has been doing too. They didn't learn the lesson in 2008 either. Either that or they learned the lesson and they've quickly forgotten. So let me just give you some perspective. There's a website I follow. It's called usdebtclock.org. And kind of a precursor to that, a couple of quotes to get us rolling. One is when they said, our new Constitution is now established, has an appearance that promises permanency, but nothing in this world can be said to be certain. What's the rest of that? Nothing in the world can be said to be certain except death and taxes. That famous quote came from Benjamin Franklin. We quote that often. And so today we're going to talk about death and taxes. But the other quote that I'll share with you is that it says, nothing in life is permanent, nor can it be, because the very nature of existence has changed. Now that quote goes back to 500 BC, but it's from that quote that many of us say, the only thing in life that's certain is change. And that's what we're facing. We're facing the potential for substantial change in what we've known to be the tax and wealth transfer laws over the future. So when we look at this website, usdebtclock.org, and if you Google this site after we're done, you'll see that there are tons of numbers on this page. I'm just going to focus on the top left corner of the page. And it has some numbers on it that really captivate my attention. Like, for instance, over here in the top left corner, we've got the U.S. national debt, $27.5 trillion. This was back when I captured it in December of last year. It was at $27 trillion. It's already almost $29 trillion. If you look at it in usdebtclock.org, that number is changing several times a second. And it's increasing by about $100,000 every second. The other number that I look at on debtclock.org is the budget deficit. What is that? Think about that for a minute. A budget deficit is how much more money the government spends than what the IRS takes in tax revenue. So in 2020, when I captured this in December, we had already spent $3.2 trillion more than we took in. Now, this is absolutely amazing because in the year 2000, our national debt, the entire national debt, was about $5.5 trillion. We spent almost half of the entire year 2000 national debt. That's an overspend. That's what spilled off the plate here in just 1 year in the budget deficit. And what happens? That adds to the national debt. So the budget deficit is up $3.2 trillion at that point over what it used to be. That budget deficit, here's what I'm concerned about. That budget deficit is going up by about $10,000 a second. So what that means is that we're overspending, and the rate at which we are overspending continues to accelerate, which is going to continue to push that national debt in the wrong direction. Take it down to the bottom of the screen and you take a look at something that just blows my mind. This is the US federal debt to our GDP ratio. And look at the 60 years ago, our debt to GDP was about half to GDP. If you go to 1980, 40 years ago, it was about a third. 20 years ago, it had gotten back to about half again. So for the last 60 years, we've been around 1/3 to 1/2 of our GDP in debt. And look what happened in the last 20 years. We're now exceeding our GDP by almost 30%. We have so much debt compared to what we've had over the last 60 years. It's almost unbelievable. And Anthony and I were talking about this before the call, that Janet Yellen is saying, I'm okay with that because interest rates are so low, we can afford the service on the debt. Hey, what happens when interest rates go back up again? And I'm not saying that's going to happen in the year 2021, but in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, anybody think interest rates are going to go up again? My goodness. And when they do, we'll be strangling on the interest that we'll have on this increasing debt. But then take this into consideration. It could get even worse. USDebtClock.org takes the trends and projects them out. You looked out to the year 2024 and re-examined it, the national debt, which is currently at about $25 trillion, is projected 4 years from now to be $50 trillion. And the budget deficit is projected, we are projected in 2024 to overspend our budget by more than the national debt, more than the entire national debt that we had in the year 2000. These are absolutely amazing numbers. And the debt to GDP ratio is projected to increase from its current 128 to 170%, putting us literally in the ballpark with a number of nations that we truly don't admire economically because of the failures they're having. We're talking about countries like Greece. Those countries have debt to GDP ratios like that. It is not where we want to be, but that's where we see it going. So what does that all mean? It means things got to change.
Joe, so we've been on the call 12 minutes. We've just racked up a $7.2 million additional deficit. I think keeping things in perspective, right? The handwriting's on the wall. So connect the dots for us. Carrying this type of deficit and shortage on the annual budget, where does that bring us? What tools does the government have to work with to try and close the gap on this?
Well, obviously, as you talked about in your last conversation with this group, and as you'll continue talking about, the Biden administration, as we know, has an interest in increasing tax revenue. And there couldn't be, in my opinion, politically speaking, there couldn't be a better time to increase taxes. Now, why would I say that? Because if you ask 1,000 people, which way do you think tax rates are going in the future, up, down, or staying the same? What will the vast majority of those people say? They expect tax rates to go up. How could it be better than to suggest a tax increase at the time when everybody in the country expects a tax increase? You're not playing a push and shove game with the audience. The audience is already with you. They already know which direction you're going. So what I want to do is connect some dots on three possibilities that we've heard about. Now, a lot of people talking about the Biden administration are talking about increasing income taxes on people over, $400,000 worth of income, capital gains tax on people that make over $1 million. These are all the living people. And that's what I'm hearing most of the conversations about. Taxes to those of us that are alive. But there are three things that the Biden administration has talked about that if you take a look at each one of them by themselves, they're not that big a deal. But if you look at the three of them in combination, it has the potential to create something I've personally labeled the wealth transfer tax tsunami. Now, there's no certainty about whether any of these three things could happen, but any one of them could happen, two of them could happen, all three of them could happen. And what I want to just give you a look at is what happens if they all did. And I'll just tell you, I did this presentation about 2 weeks ago to a different audience, and I had a guy email me the next day and said, I had a conversation with a client later that afternoon, and the client asked me, what do you think's going to happen to the cost of taxes for people passing their wealth from one generation to the next? And he said, because I had just seen your presentation 3 hours earlier, I had a complete conversation to have with this client about this. This is stuff your clients are going to ask you about, and it's relevant for you to know. So let's talk about what are these three things. Well, one is the Biden administration has made it painfully clear that they could get more tax revenue from estate tax exclusion limits. Let's lower those exclusion limits down and let's get more revenue. Now, this is not a big push. I don't see this as a big problem for a couple of reasons. First of all, dead people don't complain about taxes. So raise taxes on the dead people. No big deal. Secondly, it wasn't that long ago where the estate tax exclusion limits were down at $3 million per person. Going back to that this close after that is not that big a deal. So this one has probably a pretty high probability of passing. The second one is the Biden administration has talked about eliminating step-up and basis of death, and that is a big one. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then related to that is increasing capital gains tax rates from where they are today, 15% on the low end, 20% on the high end, increasing those capital gains tax rates. Let's take a look at these one at a time. Let's first pick off the reduced estate tax exclusion limits. What does that mean? Hey, if you reduce the estate tax exclusion limits, more people are going to pay estate taxes. But let me ask you a question just to get your juices flowing. What percent of the people that died in 2020 paid estate tax? Remember, the estate tax exclusion limit was $11.5 million per person, $23 million per couple. So individuals dying had to have over $11.5 million. Couples had to have over $23 million. What percent of the people that died in 2020 fit into that sphere of wealth and actually had to pay estate tax? Any idea? Well, the answer is less than 0.1% of the people that died had a taxable estate. Well, if so few people actually paid estate taxes, why do we have estate taxes anyway? I know there must be a reason. It must be because that 0.1% of the population that died has massive amounts of money, right? So they probably paid, even though it's a small number of people, they probably paid massive amounts of estate tax, right? So that asks the second question. What percent of the estate tax revenue, pardon me, that's a typo on my, I'm going to fix that typo right now just to be safe. That was supposed to be income tax revenue. So you think about the total tax revenue by the government. What percentage of the total tax revenue came from estate taxes? And this is where I thought, okay, 0.1% of the people paid it, but it must have paid a lot. Actually, only 0.6% of total tax revenue came from estate taxes. So, okay, the 0.1% of the people who died did pay disproportionately more in estate taxes because they paid 6 times as much in estate taxes. They went from 0.1% to 0.6%. So yeah, they paid a significant amount of estate taxes, but still, if that group, if the government only collected 0.6% of its total tax revenue from estate taxes, that means that the other 99.4% of tax revenue came from somewhere else. In fact, the 0.6% of revenue that came from estate taxes in 2019 was spent in the first 7 days of 2020. That's how fast that tax revenue was gone. So you start asking yourself, why do we even have estate taxes? Well, if they bring those estate tax exclusion limits down, we're going to have more estate tax revenue. More people will get caught in the estate tax net, and those people who were already over the limits will just have that much more of their assets exposed to estate taxes. Well, let's talk about the step up in basis of death. This one really gets under my craw. This one really burns my chops because I grew up in a world where there were 2 forms of death tax. So I say to people complain all the time, I hate estate tax. Why should anybody? This is unfair that we have to pay tax simply because I owned the asset when I died. You obviously haven't thought this through. Because I like to say, what's the alternative? If we didn't have estate tax, what's the alternative? I mean, have you ever wondered why we have a step up in basis of death? Here's why. It's because the alternative to estate tax is capital gains tax. The alternative to estate tax is capital gains tax. What you have to think about is that both estate tax at death and capital gains tax at death, they're both death taxes. We should logically have one or the other, not both. And that's exactly what the government has recognized. In fact, in my entire career, I started in this business in 1978 and even studied, historically beyond that. Never in the history of the tax code can I find a place where we paid both death taxes, capital gains tax at death and estate tax at death. And here's why. When you think about the 2 taxes, if you want to tax things at death, just have a death tax. The problem is, here's where it unfolded. We had capital gains tax at death. People died, they had assets that had increased in value, that hadn't been taxed. Okay, the government wants their share. Let's pay the taxes on it. How do we do that? Well, you pay capital gains tax. You know what the problem is with capital gains tax at death? Somebody has to be able to document the cost basis. Now, it's one thing for the person who owned that China hutch or owned that chart, that artwork, or that piece of art sitting on the table, or who owned the house and did all the renovations to the house. It's one thing for that person to be able to find all their receipts to document their cost basis. Imagine being the executor their cousin, their brother, their sister, their friend, who's the executor of their estate. Do you think they can find any of those receipts? No, they can't. So they're unable to document the cost basis, and they tear their hair out trying. Capital gains tax at death is horrendously difficult to calculate because it's so hard to document for the IRS your cost basis. And in 2010, we learned a valuable lesson, because in 2010, they eliminated the estate tax. But what happened? They also eliminated step up in basis of death. So people had to pay capital gains tax. And you know what we figured out? The IRS took the position that if you could not document your cost basis in an asset, they assumed the cost basis was zero, and you paid capital gains tax on the entire value of the asset. Estate tax is much easier to calculate because the government came in and said, everybody's having a problem with this estate tax thing with this capital gains tax and finding cost basis. Let's make life a lot easier. Let's just have an estate tax instead of a capital gains tax. Why? Because estate tax is so much easier to calculate, because all we have to do is add up the value of your assets and tax it. We don't have to find the cost basis. So what you can see here is it's two different types of death tax. We should never have both. But what the Biden administration is proposing is that we lower the estate tax exclusion limits, which makes more estate tax, and we eliminate step up in basis of death, which creates capital gains tax, which is going to create a nightmare for people trying to find those receipts that document the basis.
Joe, that was quite a mouthful. So perception is everything, particularly in the world of politics. So, if the exemption if 99.4% of voters completely ignore the exemption limitation, and it's no big deal to increase the federal estate tax from 40 to 45%. They're wealthy people, right? It gets overlooked, right, for the broader population. But where we're starting to see the ball move a bit is this sleight of hand and step up in basis. Can you describe to us how that would impact the middle to emerging affluent classes of society?
Yeah, one of the dangerous things that we don't know about this is that, we have this estate tax exclusion limit. Below that, you don't pay estate tax. Above that, you do. There is likely to be some sort of capital gains exclusion. What I've heard talked about is $1 million. Your first $1 million of capital gains could be excluded from capital gains tax at death, but everything above and beyond that would be potentially taxable. So this capital gains tax could impact a much broader swatch of America than the estate tax. Even if the estate tax exclusion limit goes down to $5 million a person, $10 million a couple, it could still affect far fewer people than this capital gains tax at death. And so I say to myself, if I was given a choice between capital gains tax at death or estate tax at death, I'm choosing the estate tax every day. I personally would tell people, I love estate tax. You know why I love estate tax? Because the alternative is capital gains tax, and that's a mess. Nobody wants to mess with capital gains tax. But here's one of the big concerns that comes out of this. 15 years ago, when the estate tax exclusion limit was much lower than it is today, we used to talk all the time about double tax on your IRA, right? Because it was going to get hit by estate tax to the decedent, and then that IRA was going to be income tax to the beneficiaries. You get hit with double tax, you'd lose 80% of the value of your IRA to double tax. We don't have that conversation anymore because the estate tax exclusion limits are so high. Only 0.1% of the people in the United States even pay estate tax. So they're the only ones subject to double tax on their qualified plan assets. But this story, when you look at this one, for the first time that I'm aware of in the history of the US tax code, we could be facing double tax on both non-qualified assets, because we'll pay capital gains tax and estate tax, and double tax on qualified plan assets on both income tax and estate tax. This is a universe we've never played in before. The wealth transfer tax tsunami could be bigger than it's ever been before. So that's eliminating the step up in basis of death, but let's compound that problem. If you eliminate the step up in basis of death, what does that mean? That means people are going to pay capital gains tax at death. So what happens if you also do number 3? And in addition to paying capital gains tax, you're going to pay even more capital gains tax because we're going to raise the capital gains tax rate. Well, you ask yourself a couple of fundamental questions. Why do we have capital gains tax rates in the first place? Why should people pay less tax on the income they generate from capital gains than they pay on the income tax they generate from their work? Well, it's because when capital gains tax rates are lower than ordinary income tax rates, investors have an incentive to invest in the public companies, which in turn spurs on the American economy. And that overall is generally a good thing. But there's another side to that coin. So capital gains tax rates are lower, but what we have to recognize is that investors are generally wealthy people. So the American consumer looks at that and says, this is a tax break for the wealthy. Capital gains tax rates being lower than ordinary tax rates, that's a tax break for the wealthy. That doesn't help us little guys at all. The only people that benefits is the big players, right? So when you get somebody like the Biden administration who's coming in and they're intent on reducing or maintaining low taxes for the bread and butter America, but increasing the taxes on the rich, this quickly lands on the bullseye, because you see that increasing the capital gains tax rate will increase taxes on wealthy people. It's exactly what they want to happen. But the unintended consequence is, if you simultaneously eliminate the step up in basis at death, not only are you asking people to pay capital gains tax at death, but you're asking them to pay it at a higher rate. So what are they looking at? They would like to increase the capital gains tax rate to at least 28%, possibly to match ordinary income tax rates. Now, from an investor standpoint, if they do this, it looks like it's eliminating a tax preference for the wealthy people. But man, can that dog hunt? First of all, how will investors react? How will they behave differently if they have to pay more tax on their investment in American public companies? Will they invest as much? Will that slow the economy down? These are interesting questions. If there's less capital gains from investors, then there'll be less capital gains income, even though you have a higher capital gains tax rate. So what I see coming is the possibility of what I call the perfect storm. And who knows if it'll happen, but the perfect storm would happen if all three happen. State tax exclusion limits come down, step up basis goes away, and capital gains tax rates go up. If all three of those happen, we have an awakening.
Joe, this is kind of where things start to become eye-opening. You know, you combine a personal residence, a small business, a couple personally owned life insurance policies, appreciating stock portfolio. I mean, this really starts to hit home. And you know, for years we've been doing the analysis on the double taxation of IRA assets and the impact and the potential of losing 80% of their value. Give us some math here where we can really start to translate that to just an ordinary asset, where the effect is quite potentially up to a 70% loss.
I'm going to give you a real simple example here, and to emphasize the fact that this is simplified. Is I understand tax calculations are complicated. I understand wealth transfer tax, estate tax, capital gains tax, all of that's complicated. I'm going to show you here back of the napkin math, the kind of math we do for our clients when we're at a client appointment. You just grab your legal pad and you want to say, this is what the taxes kind of look like, and you're going to scribble it out. That's what I'm going to do here, back of the napkin math. Let's just assume that right now today, you have a client whose estate is worth $10 million more than the estate tax exclusion limit. So it doesn't matter what the estate tax exclusion limit is. It doesn't matter whether they're single or married. Let's just assume that we have $10 million of their estate that's exposed to estate taxes under the current environment. And we'll assume today's estate tax rate of 40% for those assets. What happens? Let's do the simple math. They have $10 million exposed to estate taxes, 40% tax rate. I can do this math in my head. That's $4 million of estate tax. This is kind of what we expect. If we wanted to, we could, buy a $4 million survivorship life insurance policy, stuff it into an irrevocable life insurance trust. We could solve this problem for our client, but it's not a big problem. It's only $4 million of estate tax. Now, I don't know where you come from, but the last time I wrote out a $4 million check, it hurt. And your clients and their beneficiaries aren't going to like writing this $4 million check to the IRS either. But $4 million is a relatively modest amount of tax compared to what I'm going to show you in just a minute. Let's take a look at this exact same client, $10 million of exposed assets. And let's assume the perfect storm happened. Estate tax exclusion limits came down, step up in basis went away, capital gains tax rates came up. What happens? We got to add a couple of additional assumptions, especially for purposes of calculating our capital gains tax. So let's assume that in the second example, in the first example, we had $10 million exposed. In the second example, we're going to act like the estate tax exclusion limits are reduced by another $10 million. So now what we're going to have is $20 million of assets exposed to estate tax. Let's assume that that $20 million sleeve of assets has a $5 million cost basis. So it has an embedded capital gain of $15 million in that $20 million sleeve of assets. And let's lastly assume that estate capital gains tax rates go up to 28, not to 40, not to 36, not to 39.7, but let's just assume 28%, a lower number. And let's take a look at these calculations again. Exact same client, but the tsunami happened. Now, instead of 10 million exposed to estate tax, they have 20 million exposed. Same 40% tax rate. They just doubled their estate taxes from $4 million to $8 million. But that's just the beginning, because they also have this $20 million sleeve of assets in which they've got $5 million of cost basis and $15 million of embedded capital gains. We take that $15 million of embedded capital gains and tax that at 28% at death. That's another $4.2 million of capital gains tax. That is more capital gains tax than they paid in estate tax in the previous example. And when you add those two numbers together, the 8 million plus the 4.2, that's $12.2 million worth of total wealth transfer tax. That's more than triple the amount of wealth transfer tax on the exact same estate if the tsunami were to happen. And in fact, if you take this $12,200,000 total tax number and divide it into the $20 million of total exposed assets, the tax on that sleeve of assets is now up to 61%. And we haven't even talked about state estate tax, state inheritance tax, state income tax. We haven't talked about income tax on their IRAs to the beneficiaries. I mean, this tsunami could be huge. So the question I asked, if you pay estate tax and cap gains tax at death, does that sound like double tax? Sure sounds like double tax to me. And we could see double tax come back again on our retirement assets, because when they bring the estate tax exclusion limits down, these wealthy clients who have a lot of wealth stacked up in their IRAs are going to pay double tax on their qualified plans. They're going to pay double tax on their non-qualified plans for the first time in the history of the wealth transfer tax. This is huge.
Incredible, Joe. Incredible. So let's add a little fuel to the fire. Just clean us up here with some of the income tax ramifications that are about to come to fruition.
Yeah, and let me just take my enthusiasm down just a notch and say, this is not all doom and gloom. This is not all bad news. Now, it could be bad news for people that aren't your clients, but this is not necessarily bad news for your clients. Why? Because we have tools in our toolbox that can do things people aren't thinking about. So when we're talking about any kind of tax increases, the impending income tax increases that they'd like to impose, or any of this wealth transfer tax increase that happens, what happens when they increase tax laws? Tax rates. The Trump tax cuts from 2017, they're set to expire anyway at the end of 2025. Who knows what will happen then? And who knows if it'll even last that long, because I don't think the Biden administration will successfully repeal the Trump tax cuts. I think what they're going to do is take portions of it and modify it. I don't think we're going to see an outright repeal of the Trump tax cuts. I think many of them will stay, but the Biden administration will make additional modifications to them. But the question is, does the national debt imply that we have to have tax increases? I don't think tax laws can stay the same. I think taxes have to go up. I think we should be planning for it. Our clients are prepared for it. They'll tell you they're expecting tax rates to go up. So where's the silver lining on the cloud? Well, if income tax rates, not cap gains tax, not estate tax, but if income tax rates increase, people are going to be looking for ways to reduce their income taxes in the future. What's one way to do that? It's life insurance. Stuff a bunch of your money inside life insurance. Get tax-free growth, get tax-free access during retirement, get tax-free distribution to your beneficiaries. In fact, when you get that tax-free distribution to your beneficiaries in life insurance, it's something that, I'll bring it up in just a second. What about the other things that we're concerned about? Well, if the individual income tax rates increase, we'll use LIRPs. We'll stuff money inside life insurance policies where they can grow without capital gains tax. They can grow without income tax. You can access them tax-free. They pass on tax-free. So if the tax rates increase on income tax, this will be an opportunity for more life insurance policies to be sold to your clients that are accumulating wealth. What if they succeed in repealing the step up in basis and we have to pay the double tax on that? Well, two things I'll tell you about there. One is we can, of course, buy life insurance that can help offset the impact of the capital gains tax at death. So if you're going to pay, in our previous example, $4.2 million worth of capital gains tax at death, well, we can buy a $4.2 million irrevocable life insurance policy in an irrevocable trust, and that'll help offset that problem. But there's a second part of cap gains that I think is really going to become interesting with life insurance, and that's this. Let me say you bought a GUL policy, $1 million death benefit in a GUL. You're 50 years old. Your premiums in that GUL policy are probably going to be in the neighborhood of $25,000 to $30,000 a year. Let's just call it, well, let me think that math again. It's not going to be that high. I did a calculation on one of these just recently. I did a 50-year-old buying $1 million GUL policy. Their total premiums to age 85 were $300,000. So let's do a quick example. Now your client dies with that $1 million GUL policy. What's their cost basis in that policy? It's the $300,000 of premium they paid. What did their beneficiaries get? $1 million. How much tax did they pay? Zero. What is that like? That is suspiciously similar to a step up in basis of death. You see, the death benefit in life insurance is not taxable. So any amount of increase in value over your cost basis in life insurance is like getting a step up in basis of death. So if your client has assets that have potential exposure to capital gains tax at death, move those assets into a life insurance policy. And do it now so that as that asset continues to appreciate, your clients will get the death benefit and they'll get that asset income tax free, and it'll be like getting step up in base of death. You will actually beat the system if you do that. And thirdly, if the estate tax exclusion limits come down, we'll be back in the game we used to be in. We'll have double tax on qualified plan assets. We'll have double tax on non-qualified assets, and we'll be buying a bunch of second-to-die life insurance policies and stuffing them in irrevocable life insurance trusts to help offset the implication. So yes, these taxes are doom and gloom to those who fail to prepare. But when you get out and communicate to your clients the potential problem and the opportunities for the solution, then you have a real opportunity. So I finish by asking, will the perfect storm happen? Do you think it's possible that they will lower estate tax exclusion limits, eliminate step up in basis, and increase capital gains tax? Well, it's politics as usual, folks. I don't know if they can get it through. These are pretty dramatic changes, especially eliminating step up in basis and increasing capital gains tax rates. Those are pretty dramatic things. Can the economy handle increased capital gains tax rates for living investors who might lose their incentive to invest as heavily in corporate America? I don't know. I expect a lot of pushback. We've got a very divided government, and I don't think any of these will go through easily, but we need to be prepared for the fact that it could happen. You know, I have a colleague of mine who once said to me about 25 years ago, Joe, there's two things you don't want to see being made. It's sausage and tax law. And he said that to me while I was enjoying a nice big Polska kielbasa, right? So I'm having this beautiful sausage, and he says, you don't want to see sausage being made. If you do, you'll never eat it again. So I've never watched sausage being made. And he said, you don't want to see tax law being made either. But if any of these changes happen after they go through that ugly grinder we know as Washington, boy, not only could it create problems for clients, but it can create huge opportunities for us in our industry. So I leave you with a couple of quotes. First is, it's human nature that we make decisions to avoid pain and create pleasure. And when the government makes changes in the tax law that create pain for our clients, they're going to be looking for ways to alleviate that pain. If we can provide ways to alleviate the pain and replace it with pleasure, our clients will look to us as their primary planner to be able to get that job done for them. Second quote I'll leave you with is, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's from Isaac Newton's laws of physics and gravity. If the government takes an action and changes the tax law to the detriment of the consumer will take an equal and opposite reaction. But they need our help to do it, because without us, they don't know what to do. With us, they can move forward and achieve their financial goals even after tax law change, even better than they do now. So, Anthony, I know that was a lot of stuff to cover in 45 minutes. We do have a little bit of time for Q&A, but you'll all laugh at this. In about 5 minutes, I got to jump off because I got to head over to get my first of 2 COVID shots. And my appointment is such that if I don't leave in about 6 minutes, I'm not going to be on time. So we got a few minutes for some Q&A. If anybody has any questions about that, or Anthony, turn it back to you to put a ribbon and a bow on this. We'll bring it in for a landing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll put Anthony and I back on video.
Joe,
Anthony, back to you.
Yeah, that was incredible. So I want to thank you for bringing us the awareness. There are quite literally multiple emails and webinars and paid for seminars to learn about what may happen. And the truth of the matter is, we don't know what may happen, but we sure do. We're not in the prediction business, but we sure do want to understand what could happen and start to position and talk to our clients about this moving, this football of this political football of tax. I'm going to give you, Joe, because you are humble, just a quick shameless plug on AIG. AIG is still committed to the GUL marketplace. They have both chronic illness and longevity riders attached to their GUL. If you're looking for accumulation product, they have built a no gimmick, low cost IUL, which also happens to support the highest performing volatility control index in the marketplace in 2020. They have a Merrill Lynch strategic balanced index, and for a vol control account, they've surpassed 11% in annual return, and that's an uncapped. Given the close proximity to our 12:45, Joe, I'm going to take questions offline and be sure to respond to everyone individually. Folks, thank you for joining us. Today's session will be recorded. You will get a copy within the hour. I wish you and your families a wonderful holiday, and I thank you for attending. Everyone stay safe and enjoy the weekend. Be well.